Imagine
I'm not
standing
here to
on
argue,
the
Captain.
tarmac of your
I have
own
a flight to
private
catch.
jet,
Not until I
the
get
one
clearance
you
from the
paid
man
for,
upstairs.
only to
Orders
be
are
told
orders.
You
you
have
don't
it, you just
belong
don't know
there.
it yet.
That's
Gentlemen, let's
exactly
keep this
what
civil.
happened to
We need to leave
Marcus
in
Webb,
5.
Step
a
aside,
self-made
Captain. I'll take
CEO
responsibility.
worth
All right,
over
your call.
$200 million when a pilot decided that the color of his skin was reason enough to deny him access to his own aircraft. What started as a routine business trip turned into a humiliating standoff that would cost one man his career and expose a truth many refuse to see, that no amount of success can shield you from the sting of prejudice. The pilot thought he was protecting his passengers. He had no idea he was about to destroy his future.
Marcus Webb didn't come from money. He came from a single-bedroom apartment in South Chicago, where his mother worked 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. But Marcus had something money couldn't buy: a relentless drive and a mind sharp enough to see opportunities where others saw obstacles. By the time he was 35, he'd built a tech consulting firm from scratch, securing contracts with Fortune 500 companies and employing over 300 people. His success wasn't handed to him. It was earned through sleepless nights, countless rejections, and an unwavering refusal to let anyone's expectations define his limits. On this particular Friday morning in late September, Marcus was scheduled to fly from Chicago to Seattle for a critical merger negotiation. Time was everything. The deal was worth $80 million, and if he didn't arrive by noon, the entire partnership could collapse. He'd arranged for a private charter, a Gulfstream G650, because commercial flights wouldn't get him there in time. It wasn't about luxury, it was about necessity. Marcus arrived at the private terminal at O'Hare exactly 40 minutes before departure, dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, leather briefcase in hand, every detail of his appearance screaming professionalism. He'd made this trip dozens of times before. Private charters were part of his routine now, though he never took them for granted. He remembered too well what it felt like to stretch a dollar, to count coins for bus fare, to wonder if he'd ever make it out of the neighborhood that seemed designed to trap people like him. The terminal was quiet that morning. Just a few other travelers, mostly businessmen in expensive watches and crisp shirts, moving through security with the ease of people who belonged. Marcus checked in at the front desk without issue. His assistant, Jennifer, had already confirmed everything twice. The flight crew had his itinerary, the aircraft was fueled and ready, everything was on schedule. As Marcus walked across the tarmac toward the gleaming white jet, the autumn sun just beginning to rise behind him, he felt a familiar sense of accomplishment. This was his life now. He'd built it, he'd earned it. And yet, somewhere in the back of his mind, there was always a whisper, a quiet reminder that no matter how high he climbed, there would always be people ready to remind him that he didn't belong. He reached the air stairs and placed his foot on the first step when a voice called out from above. "Excuse me, sir. Can I help you?" Marcus looked up to see the pilot standing at the top of the stairs, arms crossed, expression neutral but eyes sharp with suspicion. The man was in his early 50s, white with graying hair and a crisp white uniform. Behind him stood 2 flight attendants in black uniforms with turquoise scarves, their faces polite but watchful. "I'm Marcus Webb," Marcus said calmly, lifting his boarding pass slightly. "I'm your passenger." The pilot didn't move. He glanced back at the attendants, then down at Marcus again, his gaze lingering a moment too long. "I'm going to need to see some identification," the pilot said. Marcus paused. It wasn't an unusual request, except that he'd already been cleared by security, already checked in, and was literally standing at the stairs of the aircraft chartered in his name. But he'd learned long ago to pick his battles. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his driver's license and boarding confirmation, holding them up. The pilot descended a few steps, took the documents, and examined them with an intensity that felt deliberate. Marcus could feel the weight of the moment, the subtle shift in the air, the way the attendants avoided eye contact, the way time seemed to slow down in that space between respect and suspicion. Something was wrong, and Marcus knew exactly what it was.
The pilot studied the ID for what felt like an eternity before finally speaking. "This says Marcus Webb," he said slowly, as if the name itself required verification. but I'm going to need additional confirmation. We've had issues before with unauthorized passengers." Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the kind that comes not from fear, but from exhaustion. Exhaustion at having to prove himself yet again. Exhaustion at being guilty until proven innocent. He kept his voice steady. "I chartered this flight. My company paid for it. Jennifer Kim, my assistant, coordinated everything with your dispatch. You should have all the details." The pilot glanced back at the attendants again, then returned his attention to Marcus. "Right, well, we just need to be sure. You understand. Security protocols." Marcus understood perfectly. He understood that security protocols was code. He understood that if he'd been white, this conversation wouldn't be happening. He understood that his $4,000 suit, his briefcase, his documentation, none of it mattered when measured against the color of his skin. "I've flown private charters dozens of times," Marcus said, his patience thinning. "I've never had this issue before." "Well, you're having it now," the pilot replied, his tone hardening. "I'm responsible for the safety of this aircraft and everyone on board. If I don't feel comfortable, I'm not taking off." "Who else is on board?" Marcus asked. The pilot hesitated. "That's confidential passenger information." "I'm the only passenger," Marcus said flatly. "I chartered the entire jet." The pilot's jaw tightened. Behind him, one of the attendants whispered something, but he waved her off. He descended another step, now standing just a few feet above Marcus, using the stairs to maintain a physical position of authority. "Look," the pilot said, lowering his voice as if trying to sound reasonable, "I don't know how you got this boarding pass or who you talked to, but I can't just let anyone onto this aircraft. You could be, I don't know, a threat." The word hung in the air like poison. A threat. Marcus stared at him, his mind racing through every possible response. He could call his assistant. He could demand to speak to the charter company. He could pull up bank statements showing the $47,000 wire transfer for this flight. He could do all of that, and none of it would matter because in this moment, on this tarmac, in the eyes of this pilot, Marcus Webb wasn't a CEO, he wasn't a businessman. He wasn't even a human being with rights and dignity. He was a threat. "Let me call my assistant," Marcus said, keeping his voice calm despite the anger rising inside him. "She can confirm everything." "I'd prefer to handle this through official channels." The pilot pulled out his phone. "I'm going to contact our operations manager." Marcus waited, standing at the bottom of the stairs like a man being denied entry to his own home. The sun climbed higher. Minutes passed. Other passengers in the distance boarded their planes without incident, without interrogation, without having to prove their humanity. Finally, the pilot finished his call. He looked down at Marcus with an expression that was somehow both apologetic and defensive. "Operations says they have a Marcus Webb on file, but they need to verify your identity further. They're asking you to return to the terminal for additional screening." "Additional screening?" Marcus repeated, disbelief cutting through his composure. "I've already been through security. I have my boarding pass. I have my ID. What more do you need?" "Sir, I'm just following protocol." "No, you're not following protocol. You're profiling me. You saw a black man approaching your plane and decided I didn't belong here. That's what this is." The pilot's face flushed red. "That's not... I don't appreciate the accusation. I treat every passenger the same." "Do you? Do you make every passenger show extra ID? Do you call operations to verify every name, or just the ones that don't look like you?" One of the attendants stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Sir, maybe it's best if we all take a moment." "I don't need a moment. I need to board the plane I paid for so I can get to a meeting that will determine the future of my company. I need to be treated like a human being. I need..." "Sir, if you don't calm down, I'll have security remove you from the premises," the pilot said, his hand moving toward his radio. And there it was, the ultimate power play, the threat of force, the implication that Marcus, standing calmly with his briefcase and boarding pass, was somehow a danger that needed to be neutralized. Behind the pilot, Another figure appeared at the top of the stairs. A white man in a black suit, older, with silver hair and an air of authority. He glanced at the scene unfolding below, confusion crossing his face. "What's going on here?" the man asked. The pilot turned. "Just a security issue, Mr. Richardson. Nothing to worry about." But Mr. Richardson, whoever he was, frowned. He looked at Marcus, then at the pilot, then back at Marcus. "Is that Marcus Webb?" Richardson asked. The pilot hesitated. "We're still verifying." "Marcus Webb from Webb Consulting?" Richardson descended the stairs quickly, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm. "The Marcus Webb?" Marcus met his eyes, recognition flickering. He'd seen this man before, at a conference maybe, or in a trade publication. Someone from the industry. "Yes," Marcus said simply. Richardson turned to the pilot, his voice sharp. "Do you have any idea who you're talking to? This man runs one of the most successful consulting firms in the Midwest. He's been featured in Forbes. I didn't know," the pilot stammered. "You didn't know because you didn't ask. You didn't ask because you'd already decided."
The tarmac seemed to shrink in that moment, the world contracting to this single point of tension, where everything Marcus had built, every achievement, every milestone, every barrier he'd broken, suddenly felt meaningless against the simple, brutal reality of prejudice. Richardson stood frozen between Marcus and the pilot, his face a mixture of horror and embarrassment, as if he'd just witnessed something he couldn't unsee. The pilot, meanwhile, had gone pale, his earlier confidence evaporating as the magnitude of his mistake began to settle in. "I was just doing my job," the pilot said, his voice weaker now, defensive. "I have to vet passengers. It's policy." "It's not policy to humiliate someone," Marcus said, his voice dangerously calm. "It's not policy to assume guilt based on appearance. It's not policy to call a man a threat because he doesn't look like what you think success should look like." The attendants had backed away, their discomfort palpable. Other ground crew members had started to notice the commotion, heads turning, whispers spreading. This was no longer a private confrontation. It was becoming a spectacle. Richardson cleared his throat. "Marcus, I am so sorry. This is completely unacceptable. Please, come aboard. We'll sort this out." But Marcus didn't move. He stood at the bottom of those stairs, briefcase in hand, and felt the weight of every time this had happened. Every store where he'd been followed, every restaurant where he'd been seated near the kitchen, every meeting where someone assumed he was the assistant, not the executive. Every time he'd had to prove he belonged in spaces that should have been freely accessible to anyone with the credentials and the means. "Do you know what the worst part is?" Marcus said, looking directly at the pilot. "It's not that you stopped me. It's that you felt justified doing it. You felt like you were protecting people from me, a man in a suit with a boarding pass and a confirmed reservation. You looked at me and saw danger instead of dignity." The pilot opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. What could he say? What defense existed against the truth? "I've built a company from nothing. I employ hundreds of people. I pay millions in taxes. I mentor young entrepreneurs. I donate to schools and community centers. And none of that matters to you, does it? Because when you saw me, you didn't see any of that. You just saw a black man who didn't belong." "Marcus, please," Richardson interjected, desperate to de-escalate. "Let's handle this professionally. I'll personally ensure that appropriate action is taken." "Appropriate action," Marcus repeated, a bitter laugh escaping. "You mean a reprimand, a sensitivity training, a written apology? None of that changes what just happened. None of that gives me back the last 20 minutes of my life that I spent proving I had the right to board a plane I paid for." The pilot finally found his voice, though it trembled. I made a judgment call. I was wrong. I apologize." Marcus looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not a villain, but perhaps more troubling, an ordinary man who'd acted on unconscious bias, who let fear and assumption guide his decisions, who represented a system that was so deeply flawed that even its apologies felt hollow. "Your apology doesn't fix this," Marcus said quietly, "because tomorrow this will happen to someone else. Maybe they won't have Richardson here to vouch for them. Maybe they won't have the credentials to fight back. Maybe they'll just accept the humiliation because they've learned that fighting it costs more than it's worth." The sun was fully up now, casting long shadows across the tarmac. Marcus's phone buzzed, probably Jennifer, wondering where he was, probably the Seattle team waiting for confirmation. The meeting, the merger, the $80 million deal that had seemed so important an hour ago. Marcus took a deep breath. He looked at the pilot one last time. "I'm going to board this plane now. Not because you're letting me, but because it's my right. And when I land in Seattle, I'm going to contact your company and ensure that what happened here is documented. Not for revenge, but because silence perpetuates this. People need to know." He climbed the stairs, each step feeling heavier than it should. Richardson followed, murmuring apologies that Marcus barely heard. The attendants stood aside, their eyes downcast. The pilot remained frozen, his career hanging in the balance of this moment he'd created. As Marcus reached the cabin door, he turned back one final time, looking down at the pilot who'd tried to ground him, literally and metaphorically. "You didn't just block me from boarding today. You showed everyone watching exactly who you are. I hope it was worth it."
The flight took off 27 minutes late. Marcus sat in the cream leather seat, staring out the window as Chicago disappeared beneath the clouds, his mind replaying the confrontation in painful detail. Richardson had spent the first 15 minutes apologizing profusely, explaining that he was a board member of the charter company, that there would be consequences, that this wasn't representative of their values. Marcus listened politely but didn't engage. The words felt performative, necessary for Richardson's conscience, but inadequate for the moment. When Richardson finally retreated to make phone calls, Marcus was left alone with his thoughts and the bitter aftertaste of humiliation that no amount of altitude could diminish. He made it to Seattle with 10 minutes to spare. The merger went through. The deal closed. By all external measures, the day was a success. But something had shifted inside Marcus. A reminder that had been pushed to the background during years of achievement, now dragged back into sharp focus. That his success was always conditional, always subject to someone else's permission, always vulnerable to the judgment of people who saw his skin before they saw his accomplishments. Within 48 hours, the incident had gone viral. Someone, Richardson perhaps, or one of the ground crew, had reported what happened, and the story exploded across social media and news outlets. "Black CEO blocked from boarding his own charter flight," read the headlines. The charter company issued a public apology. The pilot was suspended pending investigation and then quietly terminated. Marcus received hundreds of messages from other black professionals sharing similar experiences, from white allies expressing support, from trolls questioning whether he'd played the race card, from lawyers offering to help him sue. The response was overwhelming and exhausting, forcing him to relive the trauma repeatedly while cameras and reporters demanded his reaction. But amidst the chaos, something unexpected happened. Young black entrepreneurs began reaching out, thanking him for speaking up, for not staying silent, for using his platform to expose what so many had experienced but felt powerless to challenge. A teenage boy wrote to him saying the story had inspired him to keep pursuing his dreams despite the obstacles he faced. A college student told him she'd shared the article with her professor to illustrate the reality of modern racism. In those messages, Marcus found purpose. This hadn't just been about him. It had never been just about him. It was about the invisible barriers that millions of people face daily, the constant requirement to prove their worth, the exhausting burden of being presumed guilty in spaces where they had every right to exist. 3 weeks later, Marcus was invited to speak at a conference on diversity and inclusion in corporate America. He stood before an audience of executives, many of whom looked uncomfortable as he recounted the story. But he didn't soften it. He didn't make it palatable. He told them the truth, that no amount of corporate diversity initiatives would matter if individual people continued to act on unchecked bias, that policy changes were meaningless without cultural transformation, and that Black success shouldn't require white validation to be legitimate. The pilot who stopped me that day didn't see himself as racist. He probably considered himself a good person who'd never use a slur, who'd never consciously discriminate. But racism isn't just about intention, it's about impact. And the impact of his assumptions nearly cost me a multi-million-dollar deal and definitely cost me my dignity. He paused, letting the words sink in. The question isn't whether you're a good person. The question is, what are you doing to examine the biases you carry? What are you doing when you witness discrimination? What are you willing to sacrifice to create a world where people like me don't have to prove their humanity every single day? The room was silent, uncomfortable, necessary. As Marcus stepped off the stage, he didn't feel triumphant. He felt tired. Tired of having to be the voice, the example, the educator. Tired of carrying the weight of representing an entire race. Tired of the invisible labor that came with existing in a world that still hadn't learned to see him as simply human. But he also felt determined, because staying silent, accepting the status quo, wasn't an option. Not for him, not for the generations coming behind him who deserved better.